Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. I'm here with Colin Drumm of Memory School and some other things. What are you doing these days, Colin?
Well, mainly the member school. So I finished my PhD last year. It's been about a little over a year now, and I'm done with academia. I can't stand to do that anymore. So we've been doing this member school project where we basically we hold these seminar classes. We record them. People subscribe to the archive. That's been my full-time job pretty much this last year or so.
Yeah, awesome. So since we last talked, which was on Kant, and then before that for Zero Books, we did a brief primer on the history of money. As you were finishing up your dissertation, I believe.
Yeah.
Back at that time. Unfortunately, that video seems to have been lost to the ether of rights regarding Zero Books. So I don't know if it's available or not anymore. So we're going to cover some of that territory today. We won't just rest there. I've also noticed that recently you've been engaging with both Marx and Marx scholarship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been back to the Marx a little bit. I've been a little frustrated with the Marxists, as you probably noticed.
Right. And interestingly, even though I have a slightly higher estimation of Marx than you, we've both been ranting about how, like, can you just admit what the text says? Like, instead of, I don't know, making shit up, like, and then attribute it to the man. So we'll deal a little bit about that. And I think we also might talk about the implications of some of the historical errors by both Marxists and by MMTers and the way that it matters for politics now, because I think some of these things actually do have implications.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. The whole thing's in a little different place than it was when we last spoke. I think, before we did the first interview, I think it was pre-COVID. So, everything is right. Everything has changed.
Everything has changed,
and MMT's position has changed a little bit. So in a way, I feel like I'm worried my book can be outdated by the time that it comes out. I guess that's a professional hazard.
When we were talking last time, MMT was the left theory de jure that you could even get into the New York Times, and now every now and then I feel like I have to come out and defend it because people are kicking it for things it doesn't even say. So it's like, meh. But I guess one thing that we were talking about at the time is, well, let me put it to you this way. You've studied the history of this pretty well, and I'm going to ask you about the history of MMT. When I first encountered modern monetary theory arguments was around the attempt at Grexit and Yanis Varoufakis back when he was part of the Syriza government, etc. And at that time, its heritage was claimed to be Minsky, the post-Keynesians. There's a little bit of neo-chartalism thrown in there, but not a huge part. And then there was like this weird Roa Mosler thing that was happening kind of concurrent to it. It also kind of had the same name, but wasn't considered, and also Michael Hudson, who had a similar theory going all the way back into the 70s. But that in general, it was a post-Minsky, post-Keynesian thing. Then Bill Mitchell, Randall Wray, and then later on, even from that, in America, you had like people picking up on the work of Christine Dawson and stuff like that to come up with this neo-chartalist legalist theory of MMT, which is interesting because I think you're one of the only people who pointed out that they aren't actually the same thing and people have been acting like they are. Like,
yeah, you had Steve Mann and JMC John Michael Colin on your show already, and I'm not sure I have much to add to the history of the intellectual history of the chartalists to what they've said, but there are two different strands of it, and I've started trying to clarify this whenever I present this. There's there's two different strands of chartalism. One is the state theory and the other is the credit theory. They're not exactly the same, and they exist a little uneasily. They're a little uneasy bedfellows. I mean, really, it's Knapp, the state theory, which is you spend money first and then you tax it back, that kind of theory. But the other theory is the legal theory, which says, there's debts and the law designates the money object that's payable for debt. So it emphasizes legal enforcement of private credit contracts. And this is more of an English tradition. So there's kind of a German tradition and kind of an English tradition. And they're synthesizable. And this is the part that goes through Minsky. And this is because Randall Ray is Minsky's student. He's the Minsky student. But the idea is that once you put these theories together, then you can stabilize an unstable economy, as the Minsky book is called. So once you understand that you have this fiscal circuit and it's creating the thing that's being enforced for payment for private debts, and once you understand all this, then you can fix what would otherwise be endogenous instability in the financial system. So that's the Minsky through line.
Yeah, what's interesting about that is that for separate reasons, I was doing a history of the sociologies around class, modern sociologies of class, including the non-Marxist ones, going through the Italian elite school and the German historical school. And I realized that Friedrich Knapp was part of the smaller end of the younger German historical school, but that his research was dropped by, it was important actually contemporaneously, like people like Schacht in Germany actually used it. Mm-hmm. But the actual youngest historical school, Weber, the kind of like people who were half Marxist, half not, some of them became Nazis later. Like Weber and Werner Sombart and Otlief and whatever, they all dropped that, and it gets picked up by McInnes in England. So what's interesting is, I think you're very much right. There's this German school, but it's kind of not picked up as a major strain in the early 20th century by the historical school, by the German historical school. And then there's a weird sort of, so I noticed that and I was like, well, why aren't people talking about the German historical school more in the neo-chartalist world? And I was like, oh, they don't want to, because
they don't want to talk about it. It's a sub rosa citation. So, but this, this came up for me again recently. I don't know if you read. I wrote some stuff about guilds. I was doing some research on the guild system last year because of Sanjukta Paul, who's adjacent. She's friends with Tankus and Rohan and all those guys, and there's a lot of influence. But she's been writing stuff about the history of the firm, and it's part of this antitrust. They're trying to rethink antitrust and all this stuff, and there's some really good work in what she does. She goes back to she's trying to challenge this interpretation of the Sherman Act that is sort of forwarded by Robert Bork, that is the basis for this law and economic Chicago school stuff. And she's trying to say, look, we can use the Sherman Act is not limited to promoting competition. It's actually something we can use to do a lot more stuff. These are progressives who are looking for more justification or citational authority to enact various kinds of progressive regulations, which is something I'm not totally opposed to. But in the course of making this argument, she makes all these claims about guilds, because guilds are her foil to the firm. She wants to show that the firm is not inevitable. We could have had guilds, but what she's really drawing on is Sombart. Actually, that's the origin of the. So like the NMT scholars about money, she presents herself as drawing on what we would call the revisionist scholarship, by which I kind of mean 80s, 90s kind of stuff. She claims to be drawing on that literature. She's not actually. It's really coming from Sombart. I don't know the extent to which she's aware of this, to the extent that she's kind of, it's very interesting. So I started looking at the guild stuff, but it's, one of the things that I'm interested in as a medieval historian is one of the hats that I wear. But I'm really interested in the construction of myths about the overcoming of the medieval past, right? All of our ideas that we have about what modernity is can only be constructed in negation of the medieval past. And the stuff that people say about medieval society is kind of wild. I mean, because it's just serving as this mythological foil for our self-understanding. You know, there's a lot of factually incorrect assertions that are made over the course of this narrativizing. And so part of, you know, what I'm really interested in doing is trying to challenge those myths by turning to medieval history and letting that history be, well, both a little weirder than we want to give it credit for, and also more continuous with our own society than we might like to believe, right? The myth is about a fundamental break, that modernity is fundamentally different from modernity in every possible way, basically, and the reality is maybe a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, I despite my tendency for Marxist periodization, also have a part of me that was turned on to that train of thought all the way back in my early 20s by Umberto Eco, who was like arguing that, like, no, the 20th century is actually more like late medieval period than it is like the Renaissance. And I was like, but you know, I also am pushing back on the personally on the trend from some of the MMTers and some of the right wingers who are trying to claim that we're like in a neo-feudalism, and I'm like, I don't know if that's true at all. Like,
I think that's reifying the unhelpful concepts rather than you know, I mean feudalism is one of those concepts that's a little tricky. I mean, like, I mean, it's what there was before capitalism, and that's kind of all it means. I mean,
right.
So it's not a concept that I like to begin by assuming that we know what it means, and it sort of subsumes an entire social order under a conceptual totality. I just think that's a suspicious move, and it's not the best way to proceed.
So I'm interested in like this idea of guilds, because guild organization is something that both Marxists and, like, say, the Italian elite school both get worried about because of knowledge camps, your iron law of oligarchy, those sorts of things, and they see them as, particularly the Italian elite school, actually even more Marxist, as being a characteristic of guild organizations. But what I find kind of interesting about that is clearly, like, for both good and ill, a lot of modern trade unions are effectively guilds, and when people try to say they're not, they're kind of fooling themselves. Like,
okay, Derick, I mean, what do you when you say that, what do you mean?
I mean that that the trade unions actually are involved in the licensure. They're advocates for exclusive cartelling rights, and that they do not organize cross-sectionally, or sometimes, in the case of, like, depending on the state, teachers or whatever, they're not even organizing cross within a shop or a business side or a school. It's a specific sector of labor whose interests are being maintained. But also, I think specifically, like, when you look at, for example, the freelancers go to the electricians union, they're also maintaining, like, licensure and who can do the trade and who can't.
Yeah.
Which is not an industrial union at all. But I also, one thing I think it's fair to say, I don't know that is exactly the same thing as a guild either. It's just,
yeah,
it's like because guilds had other social functions that these unions don't have.
Right. So yeah. So I want to. I mean, so you mentioned, you know, cartelization, by which, you know, what do you mean by that? Presumably, you mean something like exclusive right to sell a certain kind of thing in a certain market, right?
Right.
So this is one of the disputes in the historiography, is that, so we have inherited an idea of guilds from, like, Adam Smith is one of the big players here. Although if you go read carefully what he says, it's, you know, it's a little tricky. Maybe I'll get in, but it's, you know, we have this idea of guilds as kind of fundamentally engaged in, like, cartel behavior. The reality seems to be that, like, they sometimes did and sometimes didn't. So it's really tricky to come up with, like, a list of essential things that guilds have to do, because you can kind of find situations where they did and situations where they didn't. And one of the things that I kind of worked through one example in my piece. People, medieval people themselves seem to have not been totally sure about what it was that guilds were allowed to do and not allowed to do and all this sorts of thing, right? I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty about that and contradictory things that happen in one place or the other. So now the people who want there are some people. So one of the things that Paul and some of the literature that she's drawing on argues, for example, is that guilds never did this. Well, that's not true. They sometimes did this, right? Sometimes guilds had exclusive rights to market things in certain places, but not always. I mean, really, the conclusion that I came to from doing a dive into this literature last year was that a guild is really most fundamentally understood as being an organization of municipal governance. It's really about the governance of the town, and what they really are is associations of taxpayers. That's what the word guild means. So in the in the 11th century in England, they have a pretty centralized fiscal system. That infamously they're paying bribes to the Vikings to get them to leave England and all this stuff. And that's the guild. It's centralized taxation. And the guilds really arose as associations of urban taxpayers who wanted to represent their interests to the king. And they arose around these guild halls, which were essentially just these buildings through which the guild tax was administered. And kind of as these institutions developed, different groups of townsmen, perceived that they had interests in common, different from other groups of townsmen, and they kind of create these, guilds to represent their interests as subdivisions of the way the municipal government is representing its interest to the king. And one of the interesting things is that after the collapse of most direct taxation in England, so England, we'll probably get to this when we do the money stuff. I mean, there wasn't a lot of direct taxation to the center in England. There's a lot of different indirect taxes. But one of the things that actually remained was the municipal guilds. So even when rural taxpayers, former taxpayers, were no longer subject to the guilds, the towns still paid them to the king. And what they got in return for that was certain protections and liberties and things like this from the king. So the king is kind of protecting the towns, maybe from the local big landlord, and in return for this he gets a tax. And the guilds are kind of the organizations through which the town negotiates its own conception of its self-interest and communicates it to the king and all this kind of stuff. So it's interesting because really they're taxpayer organizations, which is funny when you bring it into contact with the MMT narrative, the whole point of which is that taxpayers don't matter and don't have any power.
Yeah, well, I mean, the hard thing to explain to an MMTers is why would anyone have ever taxed commodity money? Mm-hmm. Why would there? Why was there, as a separate question, why was there ever commodity money at all? Right. Like that's hard for them to explain.
Yes.
And I think this is where your key point about the state versus the debt credit function of money actually really does matter, because one of the interesting things about the state theory of neo-chartalism or of chartalism is that the tokens are work the way they do because it's a closed system and it's closed by force. And that legitimate use of force is the state itself, blah 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 blah. Bunch of also neo-Kantian norms are thrown in there too that we don't talk about anymore, but whatever. That seems very different when you talk about like the logic of anthropology and like debt credit, which again, debt and credit are internal, but then you have to explain the emergence of currency at all. And from most of the anthropological stuff I've read, not just the popular David Graeber book on debt that everybody seems to think is somehow authoritative on this subject, token exchange is really for outside groups. Like, just when you focus on a commodity token, usually what Electrum, right, and which is an alloy of gold and silver, and it starts off between like church temple organizations, and there's like local trade rate versus international trade rates on this. But like, again, they're kind of copacetic, right? Like, because okay, well, you're using commodity money to trade with foreigners because there's no trust system there. There's a trust system in terms of the group. But then you think about, well, the state narrative implies that there's no trust system there either. The reason why you trade in, you know, these monies is because you're compelled to, which is why they're always going for examples like Rhodesia or like ancient Mesopotamia or whatever. Like, it's like all their examples are all like very coercive imperial arrangements. And then separately, and kind of as like the weird unexplained off to like why this works this way in modern times, they'll talk about colonial America and the various forms of particularly pre-revolutionary and early revolutionary paper money.
Yes. So okay, I'm gonna throw somebody under the bus here. I haven't addressed this book because it's just it's not really worth it, but it illustrates the problem here. There's a new book by a guy named Jacob Feinig. It's called Moral Economies of Money. It's about this American stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So the moral economy language is another thing that a lot of these writers are taking up. That's a concept with an interesting history. When what they mean by a moral economy, of course, is an economy that is being regulated by morally enlightened policymakers. Which is not exactly what E.P. Thompson meant by a moral economy.
No, and the history, like, yes, you can go to E.P. Thompson for that phrasing, but what I know about morally normative economics is younger historical school, and they're all neo-Kantians.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah, the moral economy thing as a whole, I would point out that I mean racism is a moral economy. I mean
right, yes.
When you don't let black people into the country club, that's moral economy, because moral economy is about and the guilds are also about moral economy too. I mean, it's about policing creditworthiness, the status, the standing of people within a credit network, and subjecting them to various kinds of moral discipline that basically ensure that debts within the group are going to be good, right? So it creates the conditions of credit worthiness through moral discipline. I mean, that's what that kind of moral economy is about. There's the peasant riots and stuff, which we can talk about if you want. But what I wanted to say, I wanted to throw this guy under the bus a little bit because his book's really bad and it made me upset. But I mean, the beginning of the book, he's talking about the Americans, and and the point that they want to learn from this is, look, the Americans are in the New World and they don't have any money, right? There's no money in America, basically. I mean, there's like a little bit of Spanish silver, right? But they're extremely cash poor compared to the society that they're coming from in England. And the moral of the story is, look, they don't need silver money in order to have a monetary economy. They can create money for themselves, and this would be great because then we can, if we learn this lesson, we can overthrow austerity, et cetera, and so forth. I assume that your viewers are kind of familiar with this basic kind of story. But he has to account for why there's silver, right? Why is there silver at all? And his story is, well, across the Pacific Ocean, there's China. And in China, the state is taxing and spending in silver. And really, the reason that the colonists in America value silver is because they're downstream of its tax receivability in China, but they're not aware of this. And so it's kind of operating behind their... This is a ridiculous story for many reasons, one of which is that it's not a very good characterization of the Chinese silver period, which is really one of almost complete collapse of state power over the monetary system, as von Glahn is the source. I'm not a huge expert on the Chinese history, but from what little I know, it's sort of obviously it's a non-starter, right? So in order to make this story work, they have to conjure up. There has to be some place, an absolute sovereign of the world who's making money into what it is. And it's ridiculous because things don't really work like that, right? There's got to be another story we can tell. So this is part of what some of my current thinking is trying to do, is to get back a little bit into the deep past of money, which is not something that I quite do in the work that I've finished so far.
So the tax receivability argument, which they depend a lot on, they being MMTers. We'll get to picking on Marxists later. Don't worry, people. But this always struck me as very weird that they insist on it in all cases. But then they'll also tell me, for example, one of the great examples that we talk about a lot of the times is like, well, there's nothing inherently imperialist about MMT. Any country could do it. It's just the ideological planners of these countries are unenlightened. That's why they don't adopt these policies. And I'm always like, oh, it's not because they have to buy stuff in dollars because they're made to buy stuff in dollars because of dollars. And then what's interesting is when you read histories like this, they're kind of half admitting that that's in their theory, because if you have this theory that, oh, silver is important worldwide because there's a central authority in China that commands silver, blah, 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 blah. Now, never mind the fact that, like, the particular time period, the Chinese state's in shambles. Like, that's...
Yeah, exactly.
But it is a massive state in some degree, right? But so you go, okay, but doesn't that imply then that you do have to like everything is downstream from imperial money systems?
Yeah.
Like there just seems to be like a refusal to like connect the historical artifacts in a way that makes any sense, because no matter how they do it, it's going to be a problem for their theory, right? Yeah. Like, and we talked about this last time. Most of these monetary histories are like ancient Mesopotamia, something China. It went back to silver. We're not going to talk about why. Blah blah blah. Colonies in America, Rhodesia. And you're just like, wait, but why did you skip most of the history of agricultural settlement? Like, and then you'll get like some stuff about like tally sticks or something, but then you'll go like, no, well, tally sticks weren't used as money though. No. Like no.
I mean, the tally sticks have counterparty risk. There's no way that you can know if you have the, what are they? If I were better prepared, I remember the names, but there's one half and the other half. There's the stock and the other one's the thing. I mean, if you have half of it, there's no way to know that the other half really exists someplace and they're going to get paid for it. I mean, they're checks. They're essentially personal checks. They have counterparty risk. These things are credit instruments. But at least some of the economists, if you tell some of these people that there's such a difference between money and credit, I've been blocked for just saying that by some of the economists because they believe that all money is credit, which is, historically speaking, I mean, not the case. There is and what's interesting is that, I mean, some
How
of
do you
these
explain the 19th century money stability if all money is credit, for example? Like,
well, that was a system. I mean, so we should
let's define what we mean
about
by
stability. Yeah. So I searched myself in your Discord before I did this and found various things. One of which was somebody. Colin, who was mad because I suggested in the first interview that the 19th century was stable. What I meant by that was the price level, not the financial system. So there's all kinds of. I mean, there's the panic.
Oh, there's
1837. I mean, there's all kinds of financial panics.
There's like 4 depressions, but money stayed. Yeah. Interestingly, despite those depressions, money stayed about the same thing.
Well, you have kind of a mild deflation throughout the period, which is kind of mild deflation is basically as stable as you get when it comes to modern monetary history. I mean, generally, either you have unit of account inflations occurring, or you have periods of price stability. There's these, they come in waves and they go back to a number of centuries, which is one of the really interesting things about it. But the 19th century is a fairly stable in terms of price level era, and that's, I mean, I think I'm not a 19th century scholar. This is not my area of expertise, but this is what the gold standard was created to do. I mean, it was a system through which all of the European countries, kind of committed to disciplining themselves through the monetary system by managing, their currencies could only float so far from the par before they would start bleeding reserves and all this kind of stuff. And it worked. I mean, it did, but it constrains, what we now call growth. I mean, there's a reason that they had to sort of lift those constraints of the gold standard in order to enter into the era of total war and economic growth that we call the 20th century.
So I think that's a key point. And one of the things that I've always pointed out is stable money does not equal a stable financial system like that. In fact, if anything, it actually indicates the opposite.
Right. Yeah. Which I mean, but that's their point. That's MMT's point. Look, if you have, I'm going to call it strong money rather than stable money, because this is the language that I developed in my work. I mean, if you have strong money, you're going to have an unstable financial system, and so stabilizing the financial system often requires a kind of compromise. You have to, debase the money, which is something we can talk about if we want.
Yeah, well, why do you have to debase the money? I mean, one, the cynical Marxist in me goes, well, it hides what people are actually getting paid. But there's other reasons why you need to debase the currency, right? Like, what are those reasons? And we can go back to we can go back to like the 3rd century if you want to. Like,
I think England is where I would.
Okay,
it's England. So so my work, so I got interested in these questions because I came from a place of having studied Marx and being really invested in that paradigm and trying to understand financial capitalism through that paradigm. Becoming unsatisfied with it, turning to MMT, becoming rather quickly unsatisfied with that as well, and trying to sort of thread the needle between them. And where this led me was to a study of coinage, precious metal coinage. So I've focused on the origins of coinage, and that's, I mean, in the kind of 6th century in ancient Greece, but then also in the history of English coinage leading up to kind of where a lot of stories start, which is the founding of the Bank of England, but which kind of emerges out of a fairly violent and tumultuous century in English political history. I mean, it's the end of the 17th century. They chop the head off the king, they depose another king, and then they create the bank. And so I got interested in studying coinage, and because the problem is that there's these various different theories about money. They're all aware at some level that when you talk about money, one of the first things that comes to mind is a coin made of silver or gold. A lot of times people, talk about silver and gold as though they're interchangeable. They're not really. But a coin made of some kind of precious metal. And the problem is that nobody tells an even really vaguely persuasive story about what coins are. So I started studying them. And, what's interesting is that most of the monetary theories are divided into 2 camps. I mean, we've been talking about the chartalists. These are people who have a theory that says money is created as money by a legal designation. There's a law, whether it's private law or public law. We're a little confused. We don't know. We're going to gloss over that. But there's a legal designation of a money object, and that's what makes money. And it's kind of arbitrary that they pick silver. Of course, this story is challenging the mainstream story that you find in the textbook, still today in the textbook in the economics department, which is that money is the value of the silver. It's the commodity silver, and the state makes it into a coin just to kind of guarantee how much it's worth or something like that. What's interesting is that both, there's a grain of truth in both of these theories, and they're both wrong, because really it's important that a coin has both of those values at once. And this is what my work focuses on at a technical level, is I've been trying to understand, a coin has a legal rating. It is indeed. I mean, we can't assume that away, right? This is what you do when you assume that the monetary system itself is subjected to something that you might call a law of value. So you think that the value of money as a commodity, or the value of what money references as a commodity somehow, is like its fundamental determinants, right? So that the value of the money is really the value of the commodity. But it turns out that it kind of has both of these values at once, and they're different. And that difference between them is an important fact about the monetary system. Why? Well, because what it really does is to create a policy spread. So those who are aware of kind of modern central banking may be aware that one of the things that the central bank does is think about spreads. So there's a spread between the Fed funds rate and the repo rate, and that's a difference of the price of overnight money between two slightly different markets, and that spread matters. This is one of the things I learned from Perry Merling. And there exist similar kinds of spreads in the medieval monetary system. They're created by monetary institutions like the mint. And what the mint does when it buys silver, it quotes a price for silver, it buys silver, it makes them into coins. And what it's really doing is pricing one kind of money in terms of another kind of money. It's pricing silver in terms of domestic money. And what this does is it establishes a premium that is placed on silver when it's embodied in domestic coin rather than foreign coin. So say you're in England in the 14th century. There are a bunch of different coins in England. Not all of them are English money. The English kings would have loved to keep all of the foreign coins out of England, right? To create this separate system by force. They would have loved to do that, but they were incapable of doing this. Try as they might. There's lots of foreign coins in England. But what the nominal premium does is it says, okay, so suppose you have X amount say you have a pound of silver and it's embodied in English money. And then say you have a pound of silver, same amount of silver, but it's embodied in French money. Well, we're going to say that that same silver in the English coins is worth 12% more than the French coins, and we're going to try to enforce that.
And we're doing it by legal fiat, basically.
Yeah. So there is a legal valuation that is placed upon money, but it's a percentage. It's a percentage overvaluation of the silver. This is what when you I'm not going to be able to teach the details of all of this, but if you're interested, you can hit me up and I can point you to my work where I lay all this out. Although there's a few math errors that I need to fix when I release it as a book. But we can quantify all of this once we understand how to read the numbers. Once we understand how to read this, how much there's a purity of the coin, there's a weight of the coin. It's defined in terms of a legal unit of account. There's a mint price. Once we understand how to read all those numbers together, we can come up with a single number that's a degree of overvaluation. And so this spread is the spread within which the market and bills of exchange moves. So essentially, what's the best way to explain this? Okay, so say you are in England and you want to pay somebody in France. You could ship coins to them, right? But that would be risky. Not only that would be risky, but also when you sent your English money to France, it would lose that extra value that it got by being English money, because they might take it to the mint in France and melt it down, and it loses this legal encoding. So what you can do instead is have the person who you want to pay draw a bill of exchange on you, and they're going to sell that to the exchange bankers. Anyway, so the exchange bankers are able to, by virtue of the fact that they have this banking network that is has branches and different exchange centers, they're able to facilitate the remittance of funds from one jurisdiction to another without physical transfer of cash. And they are able to make a profit by doing this because of the fact that the coins in all of the different places are overvalued. Basically, the total size of the spread of the overvaluation of the pair of currencies, right? So if we're thinking about the France to England pair, the English coin is overvalued and so is the French coin, and the kind of absolute value of those two overvaluations is the total size of the spread in which the exchange bankers can quote the market. And so one reason that you might debase the coin is to manipulate the size of that spread within which the money market is moving. Now, why would you want to do that? Why you as the English king, why would you want to debase your money? Well, the problem is that if your unit of account is overvalued in silver terms, then people are going to want to cash out their bills in London, get coins, and then smuggle the coins out of England because they're worth more as silver in France than they are as coins in England.
Yeah.
And then you're going to have this drain, right? So in order to fight that, one of the major things that you can do is to debase the money. What does that mean? Well, now it means that the same amount of silver has a higher legal premium in England, which is going to make it less attractive to cash bills in London and export specie, which is what everybody is trying to do for many different periods in English history. Why? Because the English have a really strong money. So the English, for much of their history, have a very strong penny. Their pound is worth way more in silver than other units of account in other places.
Yeah.
And so people want English money. They don't want to export English goods. They want to export English money. And the English are upset about that because it reduces the amount of money they have in their economy. But they don't like debasing the money, because when they debase the money, it makes the silver value of rents go down, right? So if you're a landlord and you have money rents, then there's less silver in your money, in your rents, which means that it's worth less in terms of foreign exchange, right? So
yeah. So when you go to buy stuff outside of England, which you're going to need as a landlord, then you got problems.
Yeah. I mean, and you have to keep in mind that for many of these periods, these are people who would have spent time elsewhere than England, right? So, I mean, they want to take their, there's periods in English history in which the English king barely set foot in England, right?
Yeah, hanging out in Burgundy or something.
Yeah.
Right.
So and one of the big things that you need hard money to do is to bribe people and pay for mercenaries, right? So, so these are what we could call diplomatic payments, in which, if you're bribing the Duke across the channel to do what you want, he's not going to do that by taking your note, because you're not his sovereign. He might want to declare war on you like next week. He's not gonna work for scrip, right? This is not a company store arrangement. This is a cash arrangement. So there are, Anyway, I just threw a lot of what may be more or less confusing detail on the table. I hope that all kind of makes sense.
No, it makes sense to me. And it explains like I've always wondered, like, when I look at the history of coin debasing, there seems to be a tension in the natural story, and by the natural story I mean the neoclassical story, basically. Like, they go, oh well, they were debasing the coinage in Rome, and I go, okay, yeah, but it wasn't a problem until they started doing weird shit with tax policy, and then that encourages manorialism, and that causes a problem after the 4th century. But they were debasing the currency for like 200 years, like, so.
Yes and no.
Okay,
no.
So I figured you might know more about this, but go on. So
this is, the Rome's. This is going to be book 3. I have 3 planned books, and this is the 3rd one. So I haven't done all of this work yet. The Rome stuff's really interesting. There's what's called the crisis of the 3rd century. So there's they didn't debase the coinage much from Augustus until things start kind of falling apart. Nero does debase the coinage. There's an interesting story about that I have a video up on YouTube about partly about the debasement of Nero. One interesting thing about the debasement of Nero is that it unified the empire's monetary space. Essentially, Nero debased the coins, and essentially, as a result of this, a number of other mints that had been minting other coins from before the Roman Empire. For example, there's a mint at Tyre minting the Tyrian shekel, which is this shekel that's in the New Testament, and it ceased after the reforms of Nero. So in some ways, Nero's activities was an aggressive one that kind of drove all these other mints out of circulation. But the important thing to understand about debasements is that the typical idea of a debasement is what we would call an aggressive debasement. And these do exist, okay? These are debasements in which the king says, I need more money. I'm going to just put half the silver as I used to in the money, and I'm going to say it's the same thing. And if anybody disagrees with me, I'm going to chop their head off, right? This is what we would think of as an aggressive debasement, which is a debasement that is motivated primarily by fiscal concerns. These debasements do exist. There's examples of them, but they're the exceptions to the rule.
Yeah, they're not common.
We remember them famously precisely because they're so uncommon, right? So Henry VIII did engage in some of these aggressive debasements, although it's likely that my suspicion, although there's more work that needs to be done in order to establish this, is that aggressive debasements usually occur in situations in which there would have been defensive debasements anyway, and they just sort of go all the way into. I would be surprised. This is my hypothesis. I'd be surprised to find if there were any aggressive debasements in situations that wouldn't have provoked a defensive debasement anyway. So a defensive debasement is not primarily motivated by fiscal revenue, by immediate fiscal gains. There's a reason for this, which is that debasements of the unit of account in silver terms also erode the king's fiscal position. The king is a big landlord. He's got all these people who owe him debts. If he starts debasing the money, he's eroding his own fiscal position in the same way that he's eroding the fiscal position of his barons. In many ways, they have the same interest. The king doesn't really want to do that. He's allied with the barons in their resistance.
Right, because the barons are basically indirect tax farmers for him. And so, am I misunderstanding that?
I don't know if that's the case.
Okay.
My just got to be really pedantic about this stuff. But the point that I'm making is that they all have revenues from their lands, and these revenues are quoted in money, pounds sterling, pennies.
And the king doesn't really need his own internal currency because, like, he can compel people to trade with him anyway. He's the fucking king. He's got the sword. Whereas if he's collecting rents and weakening rents, but he has to purchase something from, I don't know, Burgundy.
Right.
They don't have to take his special English coin.
Yeah.
Because they might go hang out with the French lords and give them French stamp coins or whatever. Yeah. He needs the silver rent. I mean, he needs the actual value of the actual silver as traded on the world market.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what the king does with domestic creditors really is he operates on arrears. I mean, he always owes people lots of money, and sometimes he stiffs them. I mean, it happens. So domestic suppliers are working on long-term credit essentially, and this is what the tally sticks are about. Tally sticks are about that. But the king, when the king's at war, he can't fund that with tally sticks. He needs silver. And so he wants to raise that. So this is a big reason that he cares about the silver value of his rents that are denominated in a unit of account. And in that, he has the same interests as the other large landowners, that they also have lands and they have rents on those lands. The rents are quoted in a unit of account. That unit of account has a silver value depending on how much silver is in the coins, and they want that to be higher rather than lower because I mean, one of the points I emphasize in my dissertation is that they might want to use that money to fight the king. I mean, this is something that happens fairly regularly. So they don't want to be holding the king's notes as their money. They want to hold silver. So they want the foreign exchange value of this money. And so the king doesn't really want to. He doesn't want to debase the coinage just willy-nilly. This is not the way anybody behaves. But what happens is that, so the problem, right, is that pound sterling, the English unit of account, is not just in England. It's also in France on the continent. So you can go to the exchange bankers and they'll sell you pound sterling. So pound sterling, the unit of account, is not being priced only in England by the English legal system. It's also being priced by the bankers on foreign exchange. And so if the value of that, so this is a floating rate, right? The bankers, you go to the bankers and you say, hey, I want to give you money right now, right? So say you're in Paris, in Lyon, let's say Lyon, right? And you go to the exchange bank and you say, okay, so I have French money and I'm going to give it to you. And in exchange, you're going to give me a bill drawn on London, which you've gotten from somebody else. And so then I'm going to have pound sterling in London. Well, if the value of pound sterling as quoted on Lyon falls low enough, you're going to be able to arbitrage it. There's an arbitrage point at which I could pay French money to buy pound sterling, send the bill to London, cash it, export the silver back to Paris, sell it to the French mint, and end up with more French money than I started with. Right? There's a point where this can happen, and even before the pure arbitrage point, there's a point at which nobody's going to want to use their English money in England to buy English goods. They're going to want to export the money instead. And when this is the case, you're going to be experiencing a bullion drain out of the country.
And then it makes sense to the consequences of debasement go down.
Yes, and
so
you
it
debase
makes sense to do it.
And so the point here, this is the deep point that is missed by basically everybody. There's a little bit of the literature that recognizes this, but it's not literature that's taken up by any of the contenders in the theoretical debates about money. Usually when states modify the value of the money, and what I mean by that is modify their intrinsic value, debase or recoin the money. They sometimes raise it too. They might make it have more silver, although that's rarer. Usually what they're trying to do is to ratify the value of the unit of account on foreign exchange. So there's some market where their money is being priced, and that market is pricing their money differently than they're pricing it internally. And they try to change the value of their internal money in order to follow the movements of the market price. So money markets drive policy interventions into the value of the unit of account.
Right. So, and which, by the way, I would like to remind people, they also still do. Right. like just because we moved to fiat currency doesn't mean that money markets don't matter. I've lived in places where money markets have wreaked havoc on local economies.
Yeah. So you see why I say, I mean, there's more continuity than you would think. I mean, these medieval monetary institutions are managing the float of the foreign exchange quote within a policy spread. I mean, that's what central banks do today. I mean, it's different because it's a central bank. If they didn't have central banks, I don't want to be misunderstood. Central banks are different. They're a different institution.
They are basically the prime rentier of the king. But
I mean, the issue is
bankers who did exchange.
So I mean, so the question is, and this is the question that is really at the heart of what I argue in my work, is that the central bank is something that needs to be explained politically. There's political conditions of possibility of the existence of a central bank, and the thing to understand is that nobody wants a central bank because that means that the king has a knife at your throat. I mean, the central government has a knife at your throat because they've got all the foreign exchange. So you can't. It's much harder to start a civil war when the central bank has all of your gold than if it doesn't, right? So I mean, if the silver is floating around in the money, in the actual coins, you've got all that money, you've hoarded it up, and you can declare war on the king. And what's the king going to do? Well, he can't freeze your assets because you've got the assets. They're in the money. As soon as you allow the construction of a central bank, now you've got all the foreign exchange reserve at a centralized place, and it's subject to seizure by the central authority. And so, developing, what I argue is that the development of a constitution that was capable of establishing a central bank is a process that was negotiated. Negotiated is a bit of a euphemism here, but was negotiated over the course of the English 17th century. And I think it's a big part of what the Civil War is about. I think it's a big part of what the Glorious Revolution is about. And that we need to understand that history rather than naturalizing the modern monetary system as, this is what they say very flippantly. They're like, well, it's modern monetary theory, i.e. the last 4,000 years of money or whatever, which is a thing. It's the quip they get from Keynes, who, by the way, is very confused in his essay on money. I mean, Keynes is one of the main sources of this confusion. Actually, he didn't get it right.
The way you feel about Marx is the way I feel about John Maynard Keynes. Although you might feel similarly about John Maynard Keynes, I have always been fascinated by, like, my favorite one was like, we're going to talk about animal spirits, and you're going to take that as an actual theory of markets. Okay. And I find it interesting that Keynesians, whether they are of the neo-chartalist, post-Keynesian, or the neoclassical Keynesians, which are the people who dropped everything Keynes had to say about taxation and inflation because it's politically unpopular, let's be honest, and figured that currency manipulation is how you do that, thus really getting rid of the distinction between Keynesianism and neoclassical economics. And actually, also as a side note, one of the few things I think Keynes was actually kind of right about It I think, I think that can only happen if you have a pretty incoherent theory of what's actually going on with money, right? Like, and the fact that both endogenous and exogenous monetary theorists, for those of you who know, people believe that money exists outside of the state, people who believe that money exists in the state, can read Keynes's essay on money and think he agrees with them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I'm not deeply familiar with Keynes as a figure who's never really, frankly, interested me all of that much. But I have read some of the essay on money, where he claims, he uses the phrase, the state claims the right to edit the dictionary. So what he wants to forward here is that, the state defines the unit of account, and this is sort of arbitrary, and the state can change it whenever it feels like. And furthermore, that states did indeed, change it whenever they felt like. The problem is they didn't change it whenever they felt like. They changed it when the system was breaking, and they had no other choice. And usually they end up killing each other over it in the process, right? I mean, there aren't very many examples of like purely peaceful watershed inflection moments in English monetary history, and this is one of the things that interests me, because,
or in American monetary history either.
Right. I mean, the Civil War is the foundation of the American monetary system,
exactly,
and World War II is the event that projected it to the world and all the rest of the stuff. So part of what interested me is that if you kind of look at the history of the English 14th and 15th centuries, which is the reign of Edward III, Richard II, the last of the Plantagenets, and then the Wars of the Roses that followed. The different competing dynasties actually have different monetary policy stances that they favor. When the Lancastrians take over, they move the system one way, and when the Yorkists take over, they move the system the other way. And so I'm really interested in what this history reveals about the way that monetary policy is negotiated through violence, and specifically violence that calls into question the legitimacy of the state. Right, that's the thing, is that if you want to change the monetary policy stance, you kind of gotta you have to get a new dynasty. I mean, this is sort of a striking fact, in trying to think through that has been the origin of a lot of my thinking on the matter.
I think this is actually a crucial point, and it's one where Marxists have an inclination, but I don't think actually have a theory. So, like, there's some hints in when Marx talks about monetary relations and class that there would be all kinds of class stuff manifest in the battles over money and commodity fetishism, etc. Yet they don't ever talk about that. Like, it's not something Marxists have ever picked up from his Recred program, and I think there's reasons why. And we could talk about that, because I think this is part of what you're on. But how many like weird abstractions Marx takes over from classical political economy that just sort of stick. And get even more abstract in Marx than they were even originally.
Well, what's interesting in this, there's I write about this in my review of Stefan Eich, the Currency of Politics, which is a recent book. I mean, his book is the Keynesian take on all of this, right? So so his is the Keynesian. He gets there's good parts of the book and parts that are not as good. The English stuff and the ancient Greek stuff is quite confused. But I liked his chapter on Marx. I actually found it very revealing. I wish I had read it 10 years earlier. I feel like it would have saved me some time. One of the things that and there's other recent literature on Marx that emphasizes this too, which is Marx's relationship to other socialists, particularly Proudhon. And one of the things that Marx is really driven by is he wants to show that monetary politics is fruitless, that you can't just intervene into the monetary system and it's not going to do anything. It's not really going to change anything, because some of these other socialists have this idea, that the problem for workers is the money. The money's being debased, and that's why we're not being paid what we're worth, or things like this. That there's a systematic divergence of prices from values,
right?
And so
Marx goes so far as to complain about how socialism will not take off in America because it's too obsessed with money. Like, that's like that's like a direct quote, almost.
So in a way, this is one of the central arguments of Capital, which is that Marx at the beginning promises to make the mystery of money disappear. And I think what he really means by that is that he wants to show you that anytime there's a financial crisis, a monetary crisis, it's got its origin in something else besides money and finance. That anything that looks like monetary instability is not really monetary instability, because monetary instability is a sign of, of something else besides itself. So he wants to diagnose a financial crisis as being fundamentally driven by something else. So he's really hostile for these reasons to attempts to theorize the independent causal mechanisms in the monetary and financial system. Having passed through an interest and then frustration with modern monetary theory, I can sympathize with that, right? I mean, Marx in a way was frustrated at the MMTers of his day, and he developed these theories to try to say, y'all are barking up the wrong tree. The stuff you want to do is not really going to accomplish anything. We need something, we need something more radical than that, which is the abolition of private property, et cetera, and so forth. But the problem is that in arguing for this position, he ends up constructing a lot of frankly dubious and somewhat ridiculous theories that are supposed to explain why money can't really ever do anything that matters. And the issue is that these things are just not they're not factually true.
What I like to call them the ambiguities of these theories that he comes up with leads to stuff like the value wars, which is
right.
For 200 years we don't know what even Marx means by fucking value. Some of us have some, like, everybody who has a theory on what it means, such as, like, say the econophysicists who talk about it as like a statistical reality that approaches truth, but is never actually reached. I'm like, yeah, but that's not what he says. That might work. It might fill in that, like, what you're trying to get to here, and even it's a little bit weird.
But the problem is, why are you looking for that in the first place? I mean, why is that the hill that you think you need to die on? And I'm not sure anybody really understands. They're so lost in it that they forgot how they got there in the first place. And I've been looking at this a little bit. I'm going to write something soon about the history of the labor value concept. Interestingly, it seems to, in some ways, the trail leads to Thomas Hobbes, which of course excites me, because William Petty was Thomas Hobbes' secretary, and he's one of the origins. There's really two different ideas that get combined together to create the labor value concept. One of them has to do with competition, competitive markets. So it's like, what would the price of stuff be if there wasn't rent seeking so this goes back to our guilds thing earlier, right? What would the price be if the guilds weren't artificially inflating the value of labor? That's one half of the idea. And the other half of the idea is searching for the real value of things beneath monetary fluctuations. Basically, it's a theory of inflation. So trying to figure out what would the competitive price of things be if there wasn't any inflation. That's really the origin of the labor value concept that gets developed over the 18th century, kind of crystallized in Smith and Ricardo, and Marx is the final. The butterfly emerges from its chrysalis with Marx, and that's as Baroque as it ever will get. And I think we're still paying the price for some of this conceptual confusion all this time later.
So we'll come back to Hobbes, because I have the slightly unpopular opinion, for a person who's not generally a Bonapartist or a monarchist or whatever, that, like, Thomas Hobbes is probably the best of the liberal tradition. And people get mad at me and yell at me that he's not liberal, and I'm like, look, like, Hobbes has a secular theory of state. He's got some weird religious ideas that go into that too, but he has a secular theory of state. He actually believes in bodily autonomy to an extent that, like, no other liberal does. Like, he, like, argues that, like, well, yes, you submit to the dictation of the sovereign as long as the sovereign's protecting your being. But if the sovereign's not protecting your being, all bets are off.
Right.
Like
yeah,
you can do whatever.
So I don't know if I agree that Hobbes is a liberal, although we have to figure out what's at stake and being or not being a liberal. Liberal is such a nebulous term.
What I really mean by that is like if you cannot have, and not just because of stuff that's transparently wrong like social contract theory, but you can't really have a lot of liberal the development of liberal jurisprudence without Hobbes. But I think Hobbes is interesting in ways that are way beyond like, oh, he just inspired John Locke to do his bullshit.
Right.
Like,
So my view, I mean, obviously, some will know Thomas Hobbes is one of my favorite philosophers. I mean, Thomas Hobbes' influence on later thought is almost entirely negative, by which I mean that everybody wanted to domesticate Hobbes and to contain various scandalous implications of his thought. So one of them is what you just said, which is that Hobbes thinks that if the sovereign condemns you to death, I mean, you are no longer obligated to the sovereign. This is where Rousseau begins at the very beginning of the social contract, is that he wants to close that loophole. So Hobbes is, whereas we tend to see Hobbes as, this like bad, he's like statist. His contemporaries were afraid that he was undermining the state because he was opening the door to the right of rebellion and all these kinds of. So nobody really wants to take Hobbes on board with all of the implications. They're trying to hedge against him in various ways. And one of the things that I'll say is Hobbes. I don't think Hobbes's theory doesn't really set up the stage to create the constitution of modern money with a central bank. I mean, because Hobbes thinks, because he has such a strong theory of the unitary executive, he doesn't have a theory in which the creditors of the state, those who hold the public debt, have any mechanism to discipline the sovereign to uphold austerity, right? So that's what you need to do in order to have to have a monetary system based on the monetization of public credit. You got to have you have to have elite buy-in into that project, and that elite buy-in evolves defanging the king in various, what I think are pretty important ways. And so I think that Hobbes is not because Hobbes is though he tried to hedge his bets a little bit. I mean, he's a Stuart. He's in the Stuart camp. It's the Stuarts that they had to overthrow in order to set up the bank, and so I think there's a certain amount of tension there. So I don't think it's really quite correct to read Hobbes as simply the precursor to Locke, Rousseau, those kind of people. I think they were actually afraid of him, and they wanted to ground the state in the contract, right? That's what Hobbes does, but they didn't like the implications of the particular way that Hobbes grounded the state in the contract, and so they were trying to fix it.
I think it's really, it's really interesting because the way you're taught this in school is like Hobbes is the authoritarian form of socialist contract theory. If you're taught this in school anymore, anyway, I don't know if people are, but I was. And then, John Locke comes along and roots it in self-ownership, but like, self-ownership leads to public sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera. You get the two treatises on government. You get some like proto-utilitarianism, and you get a little bit of natural law, which, bringing that good Catholic stuff back to check Hobbes. And then you skip the fact that, like, this is the same guy who writes the pro-slave, basically is a major contributor to the post-slavery Constitution of South Carolina when it's a colony, and like, and you really, and for a lot of people, that's their first hint that like parts of the Enlightenment are bullshit. But that's not told to you. But what people don't go back and look is just question like, why did Hobbes want this unitary executive? What does he mean by state? Like, does he actually think the state should have the kind of power that the modern state does? It's actually not clear to me reading Leviathan that he does. And in some ways, for example, as we've talked about, like Hobbes, if the prince is trying to kill you, then like you said, there's no such thing as like legitimate death penalty in Hobbes. Like once you're a villain, you can do whatever. You are morally justified in doing whatever.
Yeah, well, it's sort of, it's like it's legal. There's this law versus right distinction in Hobbes. So it's like legal for them to condemn you to death, but then you have the right to resist. I mean, that's right. Kind of, so it's legal, but your contract, you have no continued obligation to the sovereign because he's broken the contract.
Right.
So anyway,
yeah, I mean, there might be a legal bad contract, but that's a bad contract. Like, more or less, once the sovereign has advocated the whole reason for the contract in the first place, which is social stability and the maintenance of your own life.
yeah.
But I find Hobbes just fascinatingly weird. Like,
Yes.
like he's
Yes.
so
Exactly.
different than either the people before him or the people after him.
Yes. Yes.
So, and also doesn't start writing till he's really old. Like, I think people like don't know how damn old that man lived. Like but yeah, I mean, I find Hobbes interesting. I find Hobbes's nature, like notion of the state, to be interesting. Yes, I mean, I do ultimately know from anthropology that social contract theory is kind of a mythology,
Right. Of course.
but so is most everything. So I find that interesting that you would trace any monetary history to him at all, because that's the one thing I would say that when I read Hobbes, it's like, oh, there's nothing about economics in here, really.
There's not a lot about it, but so it seems that Hobbes's role in this history is that he says something like, what's money really good for? Well, it gives you power over other people, right? That's what he says, basically.
Yeah, he's basically like the first power theory moneyist.
Yeah, exactly. So what's interesting is that Hobbes really has a power theory of money, which is different than the labor theory of money. But his successors, beginning with Petty, translate this statement. And Hobbes is quoted by Smith in Wealth of Nations when he's running through this, where Smith says, wealth, according to Mr. Hobbes, is power, but, and then the whole rest of the paragraph is but. And Smith wants to say, well, but what Hobbes really meant by power, or should have meant by power, is labor is command.
It's the power of changing your natural world through labor. Or something.
Exactly. So now what's interesting is that this debate seems to have taken place, and the English elites seem to have been having a debate with themselves. And this debate was basically about, hey, like, which would you rather have? Would you rather have a lot of money, by which I mean a lot of foreign exchange money, or would you rather have really cheap labor in England that you can command, right? There was seen to be a kind of trade-off about this, and this comes out in Hume's treatise on money. That's one of the things that he begins with. And they seem to have come to the conclusion that they would rather have cheap labor rather than having a lot of money, right? So why is this a trade-off? Well, to go back to our big landowners with rents and stuff like that, right? So if you have a powerful agricultural sector, they care about the price of corn, and so you might want to defend the price of corn in various ways. And there's various legislation that was created by the Stuarts. There was like, if the price of corn went too low, they would subsidize its export, and if the price went too high, then they would kind of like subsidize its import. Is kind of the idea. And but all these measures were more or less designed to stabilize at a high level the price of corn. And so the debate was, well, if we crush our own domestic agricultural sector, then we can have cheap labor, and then wouldn't you rather have that, right? So the labor theory of value in some ways seems to have grown out of this debate, to say, when you have money, you don't really or shouldn't want its foreign exchange value, which you're going to use to like buy wine from France or something. What you should want to do with your money is to command domestic labor in the economy in order to produce stuff that will, increase your manufacturing power.
Yeah, so you're not dependent on the wine from France. You can drink good English beer.
Exactly. Right.
Right. Right. And I think people miss this whole, this is partially about like power and in some ways autonomy over your own markets, which leads to some things that I think Robert Brenner notes, the Marxian theorists of the early bourgeois, in like reinvestment schemes happening in England into agrarian labor that you don't see elsewhere, because there's like now if you're trying to get cheap labor and you can keep the labor cheap, and the way to make the labor even cheaper is to reinvest into technology, et cetera, and so forth. And all these assumptions do get translated for good and ill directly into Marx. Like if you know, and when they hit walls, what Marx tries to do is, you know, and this is where his Hegelianness really shows up to me, is come up with new categories to somehow make the logic work, like in ways like, oh well, there's clearly a problem with this and Smith, and we can see where this is going, so let's come up with, like, say, abstract labor as manifested in, you know, socially never stated labor time, which is an abstract aggregate that we can't really even figure out how to measure, et cetera, and so forth. Like,
yeah. So, I mean, in Smith, well, I'll test this out, and what I eventually write might be different, but it seems to me my current state from looking at this over the last few weeks is in Smith, there's kind of two different. And some of the literature on Smith, you know, is about this. There seem to be kind of two different ideas of a labor theory of value. One of the things that the labor theory of value might try to do is to explain the prices of goods, by saying that the relative prices of goods varies with the, you know, with how much labor it takes to produce them, et cetera, and so forth. But the other theory is really the labor. It's the value of money. It's this labor commanded theory. So there's a labor embodied theory and a labor commanded theory. So, you know, what's the value of the commodity? Well, it's the amount of labor that's in it. But there's another question we might ask, which is not necessarily the same question, which is, what's the value of the commodity in terms of how much labor I can command by selling it? So the amount of labor that's embodied in the commodity and the amount of labor that I might command by selling the commodity are not necessarily the same. This is in Smith. Mm-hmm. And I think what happens that just Marx, who has a good German schoolboy education, said, hey, one of these things is labor in itself, and the other one is labor for another. And that's the beginning of a Hegelian dialectic, and I can turn this machine on and make it go. And he accomplishes various things by doing that. But I think that's the kernel of the way that Marx takes this up. And I could,
I think a lot of your critique of Marx seems to be, well, I mean, we've talked about one of them before, but I'll mention it again, is like Marx assumes money has no price. That's restated by Fred Mosley.
And the Marx that. He says that over and over and over again. I mean, it's really like Lady Doth Protest Too Much stuff when you read Volume 3. It's like, really, Marx? Are you really sure about this? I mean, you don't seem very sure about this.
Right, well, because it's one of the things that even Marxists don't like dealing with, because most Marxists do realize how, and it's clear in Marx too, when Marx talks about the enclosures and whatnot, that the state is how all this is happening, but he's got to come up with a story when he's pulling from Smith to critique it that removes the state mostly from what's going on, right? So that's, you know, some people say this is an imminent critique to show that even if the state wasn't being awful, that it would have happened anyway, but I'm not totally convinced in that, because there's other places where Marx seems to very much state this stuff like he believes it, not just as an imminent critique, but as something that is true and that you could retro engineer into something different.
Yeah. Well, it's, you know, Marx really didn't want his theory to depend upon at least two assumptions, one of which is that what's wrong with the world is a result of historical injustice. So things are bad because one group of people conquered another group of people, and their descendants have all that stuff, and the other group doesn't. Right? I mean, it's a little unclear. I mean, does Marx think this happened or not? Well, it seems like maybe he thinks it happened, but he wants to say that it doesn't matter. Even if it didn't happen, we would still be able to produce the critique.
Because he wants to conflate the normative and descriptive by getting rid of the normative altogether. Like that's clearly part of the Marx operandi.
Well, he wants to show how a purely descriptive analysis can produce its own normativity,
right,
out of itself.
But not in the Hegelian way, because in the Hegelian way, God says so through negative manifestation on it. Mm-hmm. And Marx doesn't have that recourse, right? And he's got to justify this in this idea of this inverted Hegelianism, that ideas emerge from the interaction with the world. They kind of formally come out of the way we observe things, and then they stick or not stick because they're socially reproducible, right? And then that removes all the normative debates, because what he's afraid of is, well, if there's a normative debate, there's a subjective question, and I can't just say this is objectively true and settle the matter.
Yeah. So, so what I one of the reasons that I've been thinking more about Marx, so as we mentioned at the beginning of the program, I've been doing this member school project in, I have my work has kind of been out circulating. Some people have read it. Some people are interested. They say, they come to the school because they want to learn about that. And I'm faced with the task of teaching them about Marx, which is something I haven't really wanted to do, because I have a love-hate relationship with Marx. Marxism is the only thing that I've ever really believed in, and so ceasing to believe in Marxism was a somewhat shattering personal experience for me, at one level of my intellectual trajectory. So I have certain amounts of feelings about. I
happen to know that about you personally, but yes,
yeah.
Whereas for me, like, my shattered belief was in actually like paleo conservative weird.
I've never been a conservative. But anyway, so I want to give but one of the reasons I've been thinking about Marx is that I said, okay, I can't just tell students like Marx is bad. Like I've already solved that. Well, I mean, okay, you're gonna have to know. So you gotta read through this. So we're doing a Marx trajectory, and there's a member of my seminar, Jared Baxter, who has a background in German studies, who's been leading the course and just doing a really great job of it. And we read early Marx's early writings. I mean, we started with like his college admissions letter, which is a goofy piece of writing, and we went all the way through some of the there's like these debates on thefts of wood, and there's these censorship debates, and kind of up through the critique of Hegel. And this really, it's one of I enjoyed. It gave me a new insight into Marx, because Marx in his early years is what we would now call a shit lib. I mean, he has this idea. Hegel. What is Hegel's theory of the state? Hegel's theory of the state is that the state is the universal. It's the synthesis of particular and universal, and this happens through the bureaucracy. I mean, the bureaucracy mediates all the various different interests of society and creates their universality. And Hegel says, why, what prevents the bureaucracy from pursuing its own interests? And it's like, well, they have a salary, they're on salary, and so like their interest is the state. So because the state pays them their salary, they don't have any interest besides the state, and the bureaucracy is this universal class. I mean, it's ridiculous, but this is what Hegel says. And Marx, in many of these political writings, is basically chastising the state, the Prussian state, for failing to live up to its universal concept, right? He's saying, you, the state, are supposed to be the universal, et cetera, and so forth, but you're not really doing that. And what he always comes down on, he says, you're representing the interests of property, right? You're representing the interests of property. But he kind of seems to have the idea in these early writings that if you just sort of expose the hypocrisy of the state, if you expose with journalism the idea that the state is not living up to its own universal concept, then it's going to kind of like die of embarrassment or something. But this is not what happens. They send the police and like seize the printing press and kick them out. And this seems to me to be really Marx's, like, I guess we call it his Joker moment, right? Where he begins to look. He says, look, I mean, if politics is contradictory, it doesn't matter. Politics can just be contradictory because it's got the police and stuff. So if we're gonna explain how we're gonna produce a universal class that's gonna realize the idea of human freedom and all, like I think Marx really believes in this German idealism stuff about the realization of the idea of human freedom in history. He just thinks it can't happen through the state and all this kind of stuff. It's gotta happen. Well, So basically, Marx diagnoses the truth of this politics as being private property, right? He's saying whenever you're talking politics stuff, it's really about private property. It's the expression of the interests of property. And so he then has to go try to find a contradiction in property. He needs to show how property, rather than the state, contains the contradiction that's going to have to, annihilate itself and sublate itself, and et cetera, and so forth. So there seems to me, I think that Marx's intellectual trajectory is more consistent than a lot of other people think. I mean, I think that this diagnosis of the truth of politics as private property, which he makes very early on in his life, is the through line that connects that to capital. And capital is where he really tries to realize this, to show that property has a contradiction in itself that must produce a universal class that's going to realize its interests in the abolition of property. And Marx really thinks that this is going to abolish politics, that there's not going to be any more politics because politics comes from private property. And once you've produced this proletariat, industrial proletariat, this universal class, they're going to abolish property, and then there won't be any more politics. And there's a letter to Bakunin where he, I think, says this very explicitly. Or it's not a letter, it's basically like a thread of quote retweets. I mean, he quotes little snippets of Bakunin and then gives these snarky responses in between the lines. But this is what he says. I mean, Bakunin is basically making the point. He's saying there's still going to be politics in communism. I mean, you're not going to abolish politics. There's going to be this separation between bosses and workers. And Marx says, no. We will have it once we've abolished property. There's not going to be any more politics. It's just going to be, he says, it's the management of a business matter.
The administration of things, the management of the business matter. Yeah. What I find interesting about this is this explains Marx's inability to deal with classes that don't fit into his schema, like who and what is a petty bourgeoisie, who and what is a peasant, there's 15 classes that Marx mentions in his work, and he only really cares about 2 of them.
Because they don't matter, because that's all in politics. That's all inside of politics. That's all different interests and the states manage. No. Marx is interested in the universality that emerges outside of politics as the antithesis of politics that can never be represented by politics. So he doesn't give a shit about all the stuff that's inside of politics. He's interested in how the proletariat emerges as a class that could never be represented politically, because to represent the proletariat's interest politically would be to abolish the foundation of politics.
Correct, which is private property. Ipso facto, right? And this is where my own, again, made the caveat, I'm more Marxist than you, but this is where my critique of Marx actually does come in, because I'm there's all these problems that emerge after this, where we're not dealing with the fact that the further away we are from Marx's time, the more we are dropping the basic assumptions that Marx shared. The first one was that it was inevitable and also somewhat immediate. When the immediacy doesn't happen in the 1850s, which he predicts, the immiseration of the workers is going to lead to an overthrow of capital in Europe, and then it's going to all be off to the races from there. He says this in letters to Engels. That does not happen. He starts writing Capital, and it also becomes, the other parts that people glom on to Marx, did Marx really believe it was inevitable? And I'm I think he, there are some times where it does seem to be he's a little bit hedging his bets, but most of the time he does. Yes, he thinks that not only is this not just only going to happen because it is good and fixes the contradictions of capital, it's also going to happen because nothing else can.
It has to be necessary, otherwise it doesn't fulfill the task that he's set himself. And this is all Hegel. I mean, he's taking this, he's applying Hegel's tools to Smith in order to respond to Proudhon, and that's the point of Capital. And the Marxists hate it when you say this, but what happens to Marxism after what Marx, the imminent collapse of capitalism doesn't happen as standard disappointed messianic expectations shit. I mean, this is what happens anytime you've got an eschatological prophecy that isn't fulfilled. I mean, you have to construct a theology that explains why not, and that's what Marxists have been doing for the last 100 years.
Right, and the longer you wait out, the more removed it becomes from the initial predictions. But one of the things that's very interesting is, I go back and read stuff from the 40s and before all the time, or like I pointed to you, like earlier Marxists were more okay with admitting where Marx was incorrect, for one thing.
Mm-hmm.
I sent you that thing where you were arguing with some Marxists. And I was like, look, Heinrich Grossman of all people fucking agrees with you. Like,
that was really. I'm gonna have to. I got to put that in my book, and I'll thank you for that, because it was great. I don't know. I'm much more interested in Marx than I am in Marxists. I am not super interested in the reception of history of Marx in the 20th century, precisely because there's so much in between me and I can read the book and then I read this stuff and I'm like, well, I'm more interested in what the book actually says. And what y'all are talking about is a bunch of nonsense. But he really did put his finger on it. I forget exactly what it was. I should go find that and make a note of it someplace where I can find it.
It was something about value transferability, and he was just like, Marx is just wrong. He's objectively wrong. And of course, like people like Andrew Kleiman and whatnot lose their shit if you ever say Marx is wrong about anything ever. And I'm surprised they haven't got out their stuff to defend Engels on Lemuria or something. But
I mean, this is trouble. I mean, this is what I'm upset about. I mean, this is a servile relationship to an archive. I mean, this is a servile way to behave in relation to a book. Don't be servile in relation to books. I mean, you can't trust books. I mean, it's like I'm upset that I have to say this. I mean, just because shit's written in a book doesn't mean you can trust it. Why are you reading like this? Why are you reading in this worshipful way where you feel like you have to? I mean, people are like, you need to read charitably. Where did the idea of reading charitably come from? Who are these people that they deserve my charity? I'm very upset by what seem to be these commonly circulating ideas about how,
particularly about Marx or Freud or one of the ipso facto masters of suspicion.
Yeah. I mean, there's 19th century Germans that everybody thinks has to be read reverently in this way. I think partly because they're anxious about the fact that they don't know what the books say, and so they think that this performance of reverence will save them from having to explain what the books mean. Anyway.
So one of the things that you've become frustrated though in this, because this thing of Marxist history, you have been reading a lot of these newer categories that people come up to save Marx and mercilessly mocking them. And I wanted to go into some of that because I do think it's important, particularly when we talk about the avoidance of the money question. Like for example, you've been going on an abstract domination, which is something yes, that's in Marx, but it's not even that important. So why go?
Well, I think Marx needs it because he needs to evacuate. Well, we could call it contingency, or maybe I think the better thing to call it, we call it power. I mean, he needs to show that the power that determines the future of the system does not lie within any of the actors in the system. I think he really needs that. So I don't think the abstract domination stuff is really purely accidental. Although I agree that, well, the idea that what matters about Marx is that rich people are equally abstractly dominated as the working class, and that's the lesson we should take. I mean, this is what that to me is risible.
That's it's a weird takeaway.
Yeah. That's what you got from Capital.
That is about as weird as all the people who read Capital and go, we need to have more capitalism so it'll decapitalize itself.
I mean, my take on this is that this is Stoicism. This is Stoicism as an ideology that makes bureaucrats feel better about their participation in bureaucracy, and to the extent that a lot of the people who drive Marxist discussions are downwardly mobile children of the PMC or whatever. I think it makes sense. I mean, I think this is a Stoicism. It's we're all trapped in capitalism and we're all equally dominated by capitalism and there's nothing we can do about it. And so you just kind of have to You know, be stoic. I mean, that to me is what this stuff says, and I don't know if it. The fact that it's in Jacobin should tell you as much as you need to know about
that. One thing I think is implicit in a lot of your critique is both you strongly imply that both Marxism and MMT and its current narrative history are soft on certain factions of contemporary society that actually have power. One thing that you and I have talked about is like, why does MMT have this obsession with state lending rates being 0%?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and then we'll try to convince you that, like, I don't know, this was also in Jacobin, that inflation is good for the working class and stuff like that. And I'm just like, huh?
Yeah.
Like,
okay. So this is a tricky problem.
mm-hmm.
Early on, when I first started getting interested in some of the Bronze Age stuff, you know, I mean, this is in Michael Hudson and stuff. I mean, there's in at least some.
There are times in which inflation would be good for the working class.
Sometimes inflation is good because inflation is good for debtors, right? Now, and you have to, given the kind of people who are most vocal about their fear of inflation, you have to think there's something fishy going on there.
But the very poor aren't debtors. That's what
right.
I point out to people.
Yes. So there's the issue that the creditor debtor difference doesn't directly map on the social class.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, there's big debtors and small debtors and big creditors and small creditors. And you know, one important class divide might be between people who have small but positive net worth versus people who have negative net worth, right? So people who have small but positive net worth don't want inflation, but people who have negative net worth would, right? So,
and one thing about our tax policy now is there's an incentive. I mean, I know this is a lot of people think this is a conservative argument. I think it's true. One of the things about our tax policy now is if you're a corporation, one of the best ways to get rid of your nominal profits is to become highly debt leveraged, so you don't have to pay taxes on it as long as the debt rates are low.
Right. Yeah. So this is tricky. I mean, what are the consequences of inflation? I mean, assuming for the moment that we can define and we can quantify inflation, which is a trickier problem than most people seem to realize, but assuming that we can do that, who's it good for and who's it bad for? This is a really tricky question. But I think, you know, this is why I think it's important to not be wedded to the theoretical assumptions that we find in Marx. Is that one of the ways we're going to answer this question is by looking at pricing power, because there may not be a mechanical answer to the question of who wins and loses from inflation. It may be a kind of struggle through the pricing system for who can pass inflation on to who. And it simply saying that there's inflation may not tell us enough information to know who's winning and who's losing from it. That, I think, is an important point. It's something that I'd like to look at more. I want to study the 14th century and the Black Plague, because the Black Plague is a really interesting experiment in price level history.
So one of the things that I think of when I think about this is the fact that, like, what do we exclude from most government inflation counters? I'm like, well, fine, they bracket out food, and that's going to affect the poor. And food inflation right now is like actually really, really high. 2, housing is bracketed out, and that affects everybody, but has a larger impact on the poor. And at least in our system, it wouldn't necessarily be so, but it's definitely so in our system. And 3, like large levels of like superfluous consumer goods, that's going to affect like the middle and upper class. So it would affect some workers, but not all of them. And the poor aren't going to be factored into this that much. And, you know, another thing that we have to talk about here that Marx like wants to bracket out is differences within the working class, because he doesn't want you, like, the universal class requires there not to be sectional and income differences. I mean, he literally in multiple points that just doesn't matter. Like, compensation doesn't matter. He doesn't worry about compensation schemes in his thing, except for a little bit in Critique of the Goethe Program, where he makes some like major concessions on that, and then also goes like, yeah, but that's not the class defining characteristic of power. And while I do think looking at power is important, a lot of this is political power, and it to me leads like for example, a lot of our discussions around inflation do not read like they're actually about the poor at all. It seems like they're about different sectors
Mhm.
of the professional economy, so high paid workers and private capital holders, etc. Like that's actually who's being spoken about here, not the working poor, not workers in general, but we're using workers as a proxy for, you know, like actually to hide real distinctions.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Like,
I mean, what's clear, and I'm not, I don't study the 21st century. I don't have the answer for how we should do all of this stuff, you know. But it's clear that we need more granular concepts than reducing everything to a single macroeconomic identity or something like this, right? So I just want to like, this is like one thing that I have. This just illustrates how absurd it is. I mean, so like one of the ways that we talk about inflation, right, is like, okay, so you know, you have like these big investors and they're buying bonds or whatever, and there's the question about nominal versus real returns, right? I mean, so they've got a nominal return in money, but as we all know, the value of money changes. So what is it? What's the real return? And in order to say that, you then take like the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and like use that as the deflator. So like, but like, what is this saying? I mean, the Consumer Price Index like varies a lot based on like what the price of cheeseburgers is. So you're saying to me that a guy who has like $500 million cares about the price of cheeseburgers when he's thinking about like what the real returns on his investments are? No, of course he doesn't care about the price of cheeseburgers. He doesn't know what the price of cheeseburgers is. So it can't possibly be the case that we can take a single deflator index and use it to produce real prices in everything across the economy. It just can't be the case, because inflation is relative to you know, what you consume, your basket of consumption. And there's people for whom their consumption is a fairly irrelevant part of how what they care about their money. And so we would need to think about that in a different way. I mean, what do they care about? They care about the price of assets more than they care about the price of cheeseburgers.
yeah, there's another thing that you pointed out. This was in a private conversation we had in a Discord once, but I actually thought it was pretty profound, because I've been trying to figure out, one, why everyone obsesses over the individual like wealth index and doesn't look like at the Forbes 400 of families, because they look radically different, and you can tell a lot more about American power from looking at the family one. But two, I started thinking about something that you said once. Is like, oh, well, you know, the bourgeoisie doesn't seem to be doing anything the bourgeoisie traditionally does, including being that involved in politics, because it doesn't have to. And the reason why it doesn't have to, it's like you're living off of investments and stuff in a way that Marx didn't see as possible.
Well, interestingly, that this kind of person does play a role in Marxist theory, because it actually explains why the rate of profit and the rate of interest are not always identical. So it's what produces the crisis in Marx is when the rate of interest goes above the rate of profit. I mean, that's the breaking point of the system. Marx then needs to explain why, when there's not a crisis, the rate of interest is lower than the rate of profit. And his explanation for this is that essentially some people who might otherwise be capitalists are morally decadent, and they don't want to invest their capital themselves. They want to be lazy and enjoy it. And so they loan the money to capitalists, people who want to actively invest, and they accept getting a lower rate of interest in order to do that. So Marx does have although what is very interesting. So when you track, so we've been talking about how Marx has two classes. It's not, he really has four, I would say. So so Marx is interesting. He says, okay, so consider the total, you know, in what we would now call the national income, and it's going to get split up. And one way it gets split up is the workers get paid, you know, the value of variable capital, and the capitalists have surplus value left over, but they don't get to keep all that surplus value. They got to split it with two other people. They got to pay the landlord. So there's also landlords in Marx. They don't pay play an important role because Marx thinks that they've been historically superseded for reasons.
Yeah, because they're like part of the bad old feudal system.
Yeah,
so they're
exactly.
just not that important anymore.
So they're not that important anymore, but they're kind of still there. I mean, this is the thing. Whenever you say Marx doesn't adequately consider this, people are like, "Oh, of course he does." He talks about, but usually what he's doing is assuming away their importance. I mean, yeah, he knows they exist, and he talks about them so that he can show that you don't really need to care about them. But
peasants, petit bourgeois. I mean, we can go on.
Yeah,
but
they are different. So what's interesting is that Marx says that the difference between laborers and capitalists and between capitalists and landlords is a real difference, but there's another difference that's not a real difference, he says almost this exactly. It's a difference that's not a real difference. It's an arbitrary difference, and it's the difference between finance capital and industrial capital. And this is basically what he says. Finance capital is just people who could be industrial capital, but they're too lazy, and so they retire and they loan their money to industrial capital. And as basically because that's not a real difference, according to him, the rate of interest is essentially arbitrary. He says that there's no law that governs it; it's totally arbitrary, et cetera, and so forth. Because it's just an index of how much of the bourgeoisie are morally decadent enough to not invest their own capital. This is what he says.
Right, which also makes it hard to prove his point about profits. But what I find interesting in this later on leads to the finance capital, leads to Sombart's like weird socialism that's like pro-entrepreneur and anti-capitalism and all that stuff. But and that stuff is fascinatingly weird to read, and no one wants to admit that they're ever inspired by Sombart because he has that whole Marxist turned historical school turned Nazi problem.
Right.
Although I've always wondered, the worst
of us.
Yeah, it does. But I have always wondered why people are more okay reviving Schmidt and Heidegger,
right, than
Sombart, because Sombart's arguably more important. I mean, he coins like capitalism. He coins the term capitalism, for fuck's sake. I think he's the first person who uses it. But anyway, that's a separate thing. But one of the things that's interesting is later on when you get to like Moshe Postone and these people who want to deal with structural anti-Semitism, they just don't want to deal with any of Marx's writings on finance at all. Period. They just want to bracket it out.
Yeah.
Because they think, well, Marx is talking about the lazy financier. No, sure, he didn't mean Jews, but everyone else does. So anytime you hear anyone talk about lazy financiers, they actually mean Jews.
He doesn't on the Jewish question. He's pretty explicit about this.
Well, I mean, yes, but he doesn't think it's just Jews.
Right.
Like,
yes. But once we've abolished finance, then the Jews will go along with it. I mean, that's
right. Yeah.
That's the nice version of the thesis. It's not that you have to abolish the Jews to abolish finance, but it's the other way around. So it's okay.
Right. Yes, that is actually Marx's argument.
Yes. Yeah, I know I read it.
It's one of those things where people are like, no, he doesn't think that. I'm like, no, he's not super anti-Semitic, but he still sort of thinks that like Jews are a problem, and like basically he takes the laicist French approach to it. Like, if we abolish finance, then the Jews will liberate themselves. We don't have to worry about it. Like my family did. Look, we're good, whatever we are now. But we're not going to talk about his granddad being a rabbi or whatever. That sure has nothing to do with that. But in all seriousness, though, there is a fear by the other thing that I think makes a lot of Marxists run from this is there's a lot of right wingers who have similar finance theories, and like I also think they don't want to admit that like Marx's attitude about financiers is actually like pretty common amongst 17th and 18th, 19th century bourgeoisie. Like John Adams thought the same thing, for fuck's sake. He was always talking about how speculators were parasites and lazy and didn't produce into productive capital.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of tricky conceptual issues here. I mean, it really, I mean, it's tricky. I mean, it's
oh yeah.
It's something we need to figure out. I mean, and that's why it's frustrating that people don't want to. People want to take refuge from what are some of these important issues to figure out. I mean, we should probably figure out what finance is if we want to have a materialist analysis of capitalism. I mean, maybe that's a crazy thesis, but
right. And we should probably figure out what actually counts as profits too, because
well, profits are everything that's not rent.
Yeah, sometimes when it's convenient, Colin. Sometimes they're not. But yeah, I think this is. Well, here's the thing. Like, what do you do when physical commodities and rents are tied together like they are in the modern economy? Because IPs are both real commodities and also rents. And I'm like, yeah, I'll just admit, Marx doesn't have a whole lot of anything to say about that. like he like plays with it.
Why would he?
Yeah, it doesn't exist yet, and people are like, oh, it's implied in volume 2. I'm like, kinda, but no. Like, when he's talking about rentiers, he's not talking about intellectual property rents.
Well, the real problem, and this is something that I just noticed recently because I was reading some of volume 2, where he has some various. I was trying to get really clear to myself because I hadn't, I felt like I understood it when I, worked through it 6 or 7 years ago or whatever. And I was like, okay, do I really still remember how all of this works? But I was trying to get really clear about exactly what assumptions Marx needs in order to generate a crisis theory, right? I mean, what does he need to assume? Otherwise, it doesn't work. And interestingly, one of the things that he assumes in volume 2 is that that capitalists, they kind of lack imagination about how to consume more and more luxury goods. Marx thinks that he basically holds constant the share of income deriving to capitalists that they spend on their own consumption. This is a serious problem because, well, I mean, if you have a class whose role it is to consume, I mean, crazy thing, but maybe you've noticed some of these people out in the world, people who their main social role seems to be buying and consuming shit. I mean, you actually don't produce the crisis that Marx is trying to theorize. If you just say you can just have a class that just consumes more and more luxuries and is kind of subsidized in this in various ways, and this is the managerial class. So he does assume this away in volume 2, and I think it's an underratedly crucial assumption. Because Marx needs the assumption that not all commodities are consumed by labor power as part of their reproduction. So
yes, that is true.
So not all commodities are assumed. There's also luxury goods, but in order to derive the crisis of the falling value of labor power, he needs to assume that basically there isn't a consuming class that can kind of just mop up a more or less arbitrarily large amount of consumption goods. And what we call that like middle class America. I mean, that's the most powerful political class in our society, it seems like to me.
Right.
So that's an issue,
And also seems to be the generator of subclasses that totally fuck up Marx's theory, like professionals, managers, property proletariat, even though it's not productive, and and it leads to all these weird debates, and we know where these weird debates go, like people arguing about whether or not McDonald's workers and baristas are actually proletariat because somehow they're not, but then like doctors who are on a wage somehow are. I don't know. It never that's the point where that and like who counts as petty bourgeois, what counts as a level of selling capital versus just selling the results of your labor. Like, do big peasants count? Who the fuck's a big peasant? What's the difference between a peasant and a sharecropper? I don't know.
I mean, if you want to think like that, you should just like go study the Talmud because it's more interesting. I mean, if these are legalistic debates over the interpretation of terms of art that have lost any grounding in reality.
I think that's actually kind of true, and that's in some ways, even though I am greatly interested in Marxology in the sense that I think we should know what the man believed and then what people after him believed and what they may or may not be responding to. That's an important thing to understand, not just for Marxism, for all these fucking economic theories and sociological theories. And legal theories, and the fact that people pretend that sociological theories, legal theories, and economic theories are separate is kind of funny. But I mean, I was joking to you that like I keep on finding that all the original sociologists were just historical economists or elite school economists. Like, it only becomes its own discipline like later, basically, because neoclassicals don't want to deal with it and it still exists in the academy. So like give it its own thing and move it away. But nonetheless, and you and I both know how pernicious the academy's dividing up of fiefdoms is and like making sure people don't understand shit. Mm-hmm. But it is really important to kind of to look at the history of this stuff and then to actually say what these people believe, because I think that a lot of what we're dealing with now, these kind of Talmudic discussions that we have over Marxology, some of it's interesting, but some of it's also clearly, as the kids would say today, cope. Like if we find the right analytic rubric that we didn't see, that will explain why stuff didn't happen the way we predicted, because we did have a predictive science. That was one of the promises of Marxism, that the shit was supposed to be predictive.
Yes. Although I mean, I read a lot of books that begin by assuming that away. Oh no, values have nothing to do with prices. They're totally different. What are you talking about? I mean,
well, that's the value form stuff, and
yes.
that to me is the first amount of cope, because while there may be some truth that what Marx predicts between price and value shows up in aggregate, it absolutely isn't predictive on individual prices. Like, it's just not. And yeah, I used to do that too, and I just realized it was me taking like later statements of Marx, reading it back into what was plainly there, so that I would not deal with what was actually said in the text.
Yeah, this is part of what led me away from the straight path of Marxism, was showing up at Santa Cruz, and a lot of the graduate students who were there, who were older than me, who were there when I got there, there was a strong Marxist contingent, and I started trying. I've been reading Marx, and I've been taking it pretty seriously. I mean, and I would try to talk about it, and they would like snap at me. They would be like, "It's different levels of abstraction," and I was like, I don't. What is that? Like, what does that mean? They had these rejoinders to everything that you could say, and it was a settled matter. And I wasn't really familiar with all that secondary literature. I've been reading Marx, and
that's your first mistake. How have you ever noticed how little Marxists quote Marx?
Yes, I have noticed.
They just don't. They assert shit in his name all the time, but actually quoting what he fucking said, that doesn't happen much.
Well, you've already invoked the master of this, who is Paston, whose book is like reading a seance where Marx is being summoned up. Marx, knock twice if value was historically limited to the cap. This is what that book is like.
Yeah. That one's fun because the subject of history isn't even a class, it's an abstraction. Like, the subject of history is capitalism. Well, what do you mean by that?
Right. Yeah. I mean,
oh man. Oh, that book. Oh my. This is a good place to end before I have flashbacks about trying to figure out what, like, if I thought Moshe Postone even made sense. No. Like,
I didn't make it very far into that book. I got the idea. Anyway, well, it's been lovely chatting as always.
Yeah, it's been lovely chatting with you, and we'll probably have you back on in a few months. There's always more stuff to talk about. People should check out Member School. You guys are doing a lot of studying.
Yeah. So I guess I'll give my pitch. I mean, we have one class, at least one class every weekend, basically, sometimes two, and all that stuff's posted. You can subscribe for $7 a month. You get access to the whole archive. It's somewhere between 10 to 16 hours of content a week, I would say. And the way we do the classes, they're usually 6 to 8 sessions, and they cost about $250. But I give you an attendance rebate if you show up, so you get your money back if you come to class and participate, which is actually that's the secret sauce that makes it all work. It really gets everybody bought in. So anyway, but it's affordable. It's fun. We take it seriously. We do a lot of stuff. So hit me up on Twitter, and I will give you the keys to the kingdom.
Yeah, the archives are worth it. I've been going through it.
I'd love to hear about what you think about some of that material another time. I mean,
yeah, we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
I'm definitely looking forward to when you guys finally start covering more Graeber, because I have a great love-hate relationship with Graeber that makes it sound like to Graeber fans that I hate him, and I don't. But I always feel like he's vaguely breaking my heart by being almost right.
To me, David Graeber. It's funny because I'm retracing his steps in a way, but David Graeber to me is like the tomb robber who got there like one step ahead of me and fucked everything up, and there's a lot of great stuff.
Smash some shit without knowing it.
Yeah. He didn't take the right notes about where he got stuff from and all this kind of stuff. So, but obviously, I'm interested in debt and kingship and all of these kinds of things. So we're at some point we got a bunch of stuff that we're promising to do. So who knows what precipitates out of the future courses list into the current courses list. But sometime we're going to read not everything Graeber wrote, because he wrote a lot and some of it is kind of frivolous. But we're going to do his major works, and we're going to really we're going to be critical. We're going to figure out what's worth keeping and what needs to be jettisoned.
Yeah. His two biggest works. You know what I will say? More people need to read on Kings, even if they don't like Marx.
It's an interesting book. Yeah.
And
in particular, there's one chapter in that book about rising and falling status that I think anybody who's interested in money and kinship stuff should read that. It's really important.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I would say, that book, because it's sort of solid, incorporates kinship stuff, and I think leftists do not take even symbolic kinship, because I'm like, all community is kind of based on it. Like,
yeah, kinship is important, and this is, so members. I'm the chair of the member school, but Jade DeLille is my collaborator. She comes from a archaeology background, and she's the one who really does the kinship stuff for us. And I've been talking with her for 3 years now, and she's profoundly changed my thinking. And I really have come to see the problem of kinship lurking behind almost everything, including the problem of money. So we can't possibly get into that tonight, but maybe
that's the next time we talk. The next thing we talk about is like,
well, I'll bring Jade on and we'll all talk.
Oh, that'd be great, because I think I look at symbolic kinship and the ways in which we mediate symbolic kinship is hyper important to all levels of politics.
Yeah.
Like,
it's all about kinship.
Yeah, but we don't mean it's all like evolutionary biologists, that it's all just like we're related to each other and fuck the people we aren't related to. But it is kind of also that.
it's not that. So
right.
so in order to figure this out, we gotta roll up our sleeves and get serious about it.
Right.
But I guess actually I should add one more thing before we end on this note, because this is something that fell out of the discussion at the beginning. So there's this puzzle. Why silver, right? Why when they make money do they make it out of silver? Well, one of the things that money is used for into the deeply ancient past is for the negotiation of kinship alliances, which means marriages, right? There's dowry and bride price, and dowry and bride price are fundamental to the history of money, and they are repressed in all of. Nobody wants to talk about that. Nobody wants to talk about the fact that money, in its deepest origins, has something pretty fundamentally to do with negotiation of marriage alliances.
Which I find weird that no one talks about that, even though we've now had a lot of discussion about social reproduction theory, in which they're like, we're not going to look at money's relationship to marriage.
Yes. Well, it leads to some very uncomfortable places that will get you called a lot of bad names when you start talking about it. So.
Well, yeah, we all get called bad names.
Yes, professional hazard.
Yeah, we might have even called each other bad names in the past. So thank you so much for coming on, Colin. People should check out Member School. I'm just gonna inside endorse it. I am an auditor. I listened to the stuff after it happened. So and it, oh my God, the material for the money for that on that end definitely would suggest people at least do that. You'll learn a lot. And if you the other thing that I will endorse that Colin endorses, academia is full of shit. We're both
academia.
ex-academics.
Don't go to grad school. Don't go to grad school.
It's a lot of debt, and it actually makes it harder for you to talk to normal people. And like, actually, I also think it breaks people's reading habits in a way that's fundamentally anti-intellectual. But that's a whole different thing. We'll talk about that another
topic for another time.
All right, bye.
Been a pleasure,
Have a good
Derick.
night. See ya.